Problem solved. The racist cop would later say with smug certainty after pulling the trigger on a harmless dog beside a quiet black woman on a rural road. But what he did not know was that the calm woman kneeling beside that dog was once a Delta Force operator trained to dismantle enemies far more dangerous than him. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The town of Silver Ridge, Montana, woke slowly every morning, as if the mountains themselves needed time to stretch before the day began. Thin mist rolled across the open fields, drifting lazily between wooden fences and weathered barns that had stood for generations. At the edge of town, where the paved road turned into a narrow stretch of gravel that curved along the forest line, sat a modest farmhouse surrounded by tall pine trees and a small vegetable garden carefully arranged in neat rows. This was where Evelyn Carter lived. To most of the town, Evelyn was simply the quiet woman who had moved in a few years ago. She was in her late 50s, with calm eyes and a posture so straight it almost looked military, though no one ever thought much about that. She spoke politely to neighbors, paid her bills on time, and kept mostly to herself. Every morning, just after sunrise, she followed the same routine. She would step out onto the wooden porch with a steaming mug of coffee in one hand while her German Shepherd, Rex, sat patiently beside her boot. Rex was a large dog with alert ears and intelligent eyes, the kind of animal that seemed to understand every word spoken to him. When Evelyn finally finished her coffee, she would place the mug beside the door, give Rex a quiet nod, and the two of them would begin their walk down the gravel road that ran along the edge of her property. The air that morning was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Rex trotted beside her calmly, never pulling the leash, his movements disciplined in a way that made some people wonder if he had been trained for something more than simple obedience. Evelyn walked with steady, measured steps, her eyes quietly observing everything around her, the distant tree line, the slow movement of clouds, the faint tire tracks in the gravel left by vehicles that had passed during the night. Old habits, the kind that never truly disappear. For several peaceful minutes, the only sounds were birds calling from the trees and the soft crunch of gravel beneath Evelyn's boots. Then, from somewhere behind them, the low rumble of an engine disturbed the silence. A black and white patrol car appeared at the bend in the road, its headlights briefly flashing through the drifting morning fog. The cruiser rolled slowly forward, tires crunching against the gravel as it approached Evelyn and Rex. Inside the vehicle sat Sergeant Daniel Mercer of the Silver Ridge Police Department. Mercer had been patrolling this stretch of road more often lately. Some people said he liked to keep an eye on the outskirts of town. Others quietly believed he simply enjoyed reminding certain people that he had a badge and a gun. As the cruiser crept closer, Mercer's eyes locked onto the figure walking along the roadside. A black woman, alone, with a large dog. His lips curled slightly as he slowed the car to a near stop. Evelyn heard the vehicle behind her, but did not turn around immediately. Instead, she gently rested a hand on Rex's back. The dog remained perfectly still, calm, alert. The cruiser idled a few yards away, engine humming softly in the quiet Montana morning. Mercer leaned forward over the steering wheel, studying the woman outside his window with the kind of expression that suggested he had already decided something about her long before speaking a single word. Evelyn finally turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting the reflection of the patrol car in the side mirror mounted on a nearby fence post. For a moment, the road fell completely silent again. A peaceful morning in the countryside. Two strangers, one carrying authority, the other carrying a past no one in Silver Ridge had ever imagined. The patrol car idled behind Evelyn and Rex, the engine humming low in the quiet Montana morning. Sergeant Daniel Mercer pushed his door open slowly and stepped out onto the gravel, the badge on his chest catching the pale sunlight. His boots crunched loudly as he walked forward, deliberately making his presence known. Rex immediately noticed the shift in atmosphere. The German Shepherd's ears rose slightly, his eyes focused on the approaching officer, but he did not bark. He simply stood close beside Evelyn, calm and disciplined. Evelyn turned fully now, facing Mercer without urgency. Her expression was neutral, almost serene, as if this interruption was nothing more than a passing inconvenience. Mercer stopped a few feet away, resting one hand casually on his duty belt. His eyes traveled slowly from Evelyn's boots to her face, then down to the dog. The look on his face carried that familiar mixture of suspicion and quiet contempt. "Morning," Mercer said, though the words sounded less like a greeting and more like an accusation. Evelyn nodded politely. "Good morning, officer." Mercer glanced around the empty road, then back at her. "Mind telling me what you were doing out here?" Evelyn gestured calmly toward the farmhouse barely visible through the pine trees. "I live right there. Just taking my dog for our usual walk." Mercer tilted his head slightly, as if the answer annoyed him. "Your usual walk, huh?" His eyes narrowed at Rex. "That dog looks pretty big. People around here get nervous about animals like that running loose." Rex remained perfectly still, sitting now at Evelyn's side, as if responding to an invisible command. Evelyn rested a hand gently on the dog's head. "Rex is well trained," she said calmly. "He stays with me." Mercer stepped closer, studying the animal like a man searching for an excuse. "Well trained," he repeated slowly. "You got papers for him?" Evelyn blinked once, clearly surprised by the question, but not rattled. "Papers?" Mercer folded his arms. "Registration, vaccination records, proof he is not dangerous. Town ordinance says large dogs have to be documented." The way he said it made it clear he was not really interested in paperwork. Evelyn kept her tone even. "I have all his records at the house. If you would like, I can bring them." Mercer gave a short laugh under his breath. "That will not be necessary right now." He walked in a slow circle around them, boots grinding the gravel with deliberate pressure. Rex watched him closely, but did not move. Mercer stopped again in front of Evelyn. "Funny thing," he said. "We have had reports about someone walking around this road late at night." Evelyn raised an eyebrow slightly. "That would not be me." Mercer leaned a little closer. "You sure about that?" Evelyn met his gaze without flinching. "Yes." The silence stretched between them for several seconds. Mercer clearly expected nervousness, maybe even fear. Instead, the woman in front of him stood perfectly steady, her posture balanced, her breathing calm. It irritated him more than open defiance would have. Finally, Mercer shrugged and stepped back toward his cruiser. "Well," he said with a dry smirk, "I will be keeping an eye on things around here." Evelyn simply nodded again. "You have a good day, officer." Mercer climbed back into the patrol car, but instead of driving away immediately, he sat there watching them through the windshield. Evelyn turned and resumed walking down the gravel road with Rex at her side. The cruiser remained parked behind them for several long seconds, the engine rumbling softly. Then Mercer slowly pulled forward, creeping past them at walking speed. As he passed, his eyes lingered on Evelyn in the side mirror, the look on his face suggesting something had already taken root in his mind. Suspicion, irritation, and a quiet decision that this would not be the last time he stopped her on this road. The patrol car rolled slowly ahead of Evelyn and Rex, gravel crunching beneath its tires before the vehicle finally accelerated and disappeared around the bend in the road. For a moment, the quiet countryside returned to normal. Birds resumed their distant calls from the treetops, and a soft breeze moved through the tall pines that bordered the road. Evelyn continued walking as if nothing unusual had happened. Rex trotted beside her with the same disciplined calm, his tail low and relaxed. Yet Evelyn's eyes had not missed the look Mercer gave her through that side mirror. She had seen that look before in other places, long ago, on faces that believed authority meant control. She simply filed the moment away, without emotion, and continued her walk. Later that afternoon, the sun had climbed higher over Silver Ridge, warming the gravel roads and the wide fields that stretched toward the mountains. Evelyn stood near the wooden fence that surrounded her small garden, watering a row of tomatoes with slow, steady movements. Rex rested nearby in the shade of the porch, his head lifted whenever a car passed along the distant road. The quiet routine might have continued uninterrupted, but the low rumble of a familiar engine drifted across the yard. Rex's ears lifted instantly. a black and white cruiser, turned down the narrow gravel entrance leading toward Evelyn's farmhouse. The vehicle rolled forward with deliberate slowness, dust rising behind the tires like a thin cloud. Sergeant Daniel Mercer had returned. This time, he was not alone. In the passenger seat sat Deputy Tyler Briggs, a younger officer barely into his 20s, his uniform still crisp in a way that suggested he had not yet spent many years in the field. Mercer parked the cruiser beside the fence line and stepped out again, adjusting the brim of his hat as he looked across the property. His eyes quickly found Evelyn standing beside the garden. "Afternoon," Mercer called out loudly, as if announcing himself to an audience rather than speaking to one woman. Evelyn turned calmly, shutting off the hose before setting it neatly against the fence post. "Good afternoon, officer," she replied with the same quiet politeness as before. Deputy Briggs stepped out more cautiously, glancing between Mercer and Evelyn with visible uncertainty. Mercer walked toward the garden with slow, heavy steps, scanning the property like a man inspecting suspicious territory. His gaze moved across the farmhouse, the shed, the tree line beyond the yard. "Nice little place you got here," Mercer said. "Quiet, isolated." Evelyn folded her hands calmly in front of her. "It suits me." Mercer nodded slowly, then gestured toward the road behind him. "You know, after our conversation this morning, I decided to run a few checks. Funny thing, could not find much information about you in town records." Evelyn remained still. "I moved here a few years ago." Mercer's expression hardened slightly. "From where?" "Several places," Evelyn answered simply. Mercer gave a short laugh and turned briefly toward Briggs. "You hear that? Several places." The rookie shifted awkwardly, but said nothing. Mercer stepped closer now, invading Evelyn's space with deliberate intimidation. "You see, Miss Carter," he continued, reading her name off a small notepad. "People moving into small towns usually introduce themselves. Let folks know who they are." Evelyn met his eyes without raising her voice. "I have never caused any trouble here." Mercer's jaw tightened. That calm tone again. "No fear. No apology." Rex rose from the porch and walked quietly to Evelyn's side, sitting beside her boot. The dog's gaze locked onto Mercer with silent focus. Mercer noticed and smirked. "That dog again," he muttered. He leaned forward slightly, pointing at Rex. "You. Sure that animal is under control?" Evelyn rested her hand lightly on Rex's head. "Completely." Mercer stared at the dog for a long moment, irritation growing in his expression. Behind him, Deputy Briggs shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension thickening in the warm Montana air. Mercer finally straightened up, but the look in his eyes had changed. It was no longer simple curiosity. It was something sharper now, something personal. And as Mercer turned back toward his cruiser, he spoke just loudly enough for Evelyn to hear. "Do not worry," he said coldly. "I will be checking on you again real soon." Mercer's cruiser door slammed shut with a hollow metallic thud that echoed across the quiet yard. The engine started again, gravel crunching under the tires as the patrol car slowly backed away from the farmhouse. For several seconds, Mercer remained behind the wheel without moving forward, his eyes fixed on Evelyn and Rex standing beside the garden fence. That same irritated look lingered on his face, the kind that came from encountering something he could not immediately control. Finally, the cruiser rolled away down the narrow road, disappearing behind the line of pine trees that marked the edge of Evelyn's property. The dust cloud behind the car slowly settled back onto the gravel. Evelyn remained standing where she was for a moment longer, her hand resting lightly on Rex's head. The dog's ears were still alert, watching the direction the cruiser had gone until the sound of the engine faded completely. Only then did Evelyn return calmly to her garden, turning the water hose back on and continuing her work as if nothing had happened. Hours passed, and the quiet rhythms of rural life returned. The sun began drifting toward the western hills, painting the Montana sky with warm shades of gold and amber. Long shadows stretched across the gravel road that ran beside Evelyn's property. As evening approached, Evelyn clipped Rex's leash to his collar and stepped off the porch for their usual walk along the roadside path. The air had cooled slightly, and the forest carried the deep earthy scent of pine and soil after a warm day. Rex walked beside her in perfect step, the large dog moving with quiet discipline that came from years of training. They had gone only a short distance down the gravel road when the distant roar of an engine shattered the peaceful silence once again. This time the patrol car did not creep forward slowly. It came around the bend faster than before, tires spraying gravel as Sergeant Mercer pulled the cruiser sideways across the narrow road, blocking their path completely. The headlights flashed briefly before shutting off. The driver's door flew open. Mercer stepped out quickly, his posture sharp and impatient. Deputy Briggs climbed out of the passenger side more cautiously, clearly unsure why they had returned so abruptly. Mercer walked straight toward Evelyn and Rex without greeting. His boots struck the gravel with heavy authority. "Evening, Ms. Carter," he said, though his voice carried no friendliness at all. Evelyn stopped walking but did not step back. "Officer Mercer." Mercer's eyes immediately dropped to Rex. The dog stood calmly beside Evelyn, unmoving. Mercer's jaw tightened. "I've been thinking about that animal of yours," he said slowly. Evelyn's expression remained neutral. "What about him?" Mercer placed his hands on his duty belt and leaned slightly forward. "Got another complaint about a large dog matching the description roaming near private property." Evelyn glanced down briefly at Rex, then back at Mercer. "Rex has been with me all day." Mercer shrugged as if the explanation meant nothing. "Maybe, maybe not." Deputy Briggs shifted uneasily behind him. "Sir, we did not get a call about." Mercer cut him off with a sharp look. Then his hand moved deliberately to the holster at his side. The motion was slow, intentional, designed to intimidate. Rex sensed the tension immediately. The dog stood taller now, though he did not growl or bark. Evelyn gently placed a calming hand on the dog's neck. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "Officer Mercer, there is no problem here." Mercer's lips curled slightly. "That is where you are wrong." His hand suddenly pulled the pistol free from its holster. Deputy Briggs froze. "Sir, the dog is not." The sharp crack of a gunshot exploded across the empty countryside before the sentence could finish. The gunshot shattered the quiet countryside like a thunderclap. For a split second, everything seemed to freeze. The echo rolled across the open fields and into the forest beyond, leaving behind a heavy, unnatural silence. Rex collapsed onto the gravel road beside Evelyn's boots, the powerful dog suddenly still. Deputy Tyler Briggs stared in disbelief, his mouth slightly open as the realization of what had just happened settled over him. "Sir, what did you do?" Briggs whispered under his breath, his voice tight with shock. Sergeant Daniel Mercer lowered his pistol slowly, the barrel still pointed toward the ground. His expression carried none of the hesitation Briggs expected. Instead, Mercer exhaled calmly, almost casually, as if he had simply completed a routine task. "I told you that dog was dangerous," Mercer said flatly. The words hung cold in the evening air. Evelyn had not moved. For several long seconds, she simply stood there, her eyes lowered toward Rex. Then, slowly, she knelt down beside him. The gravel shifted quietly under her knee. Her hand moved gently across the dog's thick fur, resting there with quiet care. Rex did not move. Deputy Briggs looked from Evelyn to Mercer, clearly unsettled. "Sir, the dog was not attacking," he said quietly. Mercer holstered his weapon with a sharp motion. "You saw it standing there," Mercer replied dismissively. "Large animal. Unpredictable. I neutralized the threat." Briggs shook his head slightly, struggling with what he had just witnessed. But it did not do anything. Mercer turned toward him sharply. "You questioning my judgment, Deputy?" Briggs immediately fell silent. The authority in Mercer's voice carried an unmistakable warning. Mercer then shifted his attention back toward Evelyn. She was still kneeling beside Rex, her hand resting gently against the dog's side. The evening sunlight stretched long shadows across the gravel road, painting the scene in muted gold. Mercer gave a small shrug and spoke with quiet arrogance. "Problem solved." Evelyn's hand paused. The air seemed to tighten around the three figures standing in the fading light. Slowly, Evelyn lifted her head. Her face was calm, but something deeper had changed behind her eyes. The grief that should have exploded outward instead folded inward, compressing into something colder. Something controlled. She stood up carefully, brushing the dust from her knee. Rex lay still at her feet. Mercer watched her with a smug tilt to his head, clearly expecting anger or shouting. Instead, Evelyn looked directly at him, her posture straightening with a quiet precision that felt almost military. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady and low. "You just made the worst mistake of your life." Mercer let out a short laugh. "That's so," he said, folding his arms again. Behind him, Deputy Briggs felt a chill run through his spine. Something about the woman's tone had shifted completely. She was no longer simply a quiet homeowner standing on a rural road. Her stance had changed subtly, her weight balanced evenly, her shoulders relaxed yet ready. It was the posture of someone who understood control. Mercer did not notice. He stepped forward again, his voice rising with renewed authority. "You want to threaten a police officer now?" he said sharply. "Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Evelyn did not move. The wind stirred softly through the trees. Mercer reached for his handcuffs, irritation boiling over. "I said turn around." Evelyn's eyes never left his. And for the first time since Mercer had encountered her on that quiet Montana road, there was something unmistakable in her gaze. Not fear, not anger, something far more dangerous. Calm readiness. The evening wind moved softly through the trees as the tension on the gravel road thickened like a storm gathering just beneath the surface. Sergeant Daniel Mercer stood only a few feet away now, the metal cuffs already in his hand, the cold steel glinting in the fading Montana sunlight. His expression carried the same smug certainty he had worn all day. The look of a man who believed the badge on his chest made him untouchable. "Last chance," Mercer said sharply, his voice carrying across the empty road. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." Deputy Tyler Briggs shifted uneasily beside the patrol car, his eyes flicking from Mercer to Evelyn and then down briefly to Rex lying motionless on the gravel. Something about the moment felt deeply wrong, but Mercer's authority hung over the situation like a weight. Evelyn remained exactly where she stood. Her shoulders were relaxed, her breathing slow and controlled. The evening light cast long shadows across the road, outlining her steady silhouette against the open field behind her. Mercer stepped closer, clearly irritated by the lack of compliance. The handcuffs rattled slightly in his grip. "You think this is a joke?" he said. "You just threaten an officer. That alone is enough to bring you in." Evelyn's gaze never left his face. For several seconds, she said nothing at all. The silence stretched long enough that even the distant rustling of leaves sounded unusually loud. Then, finally she spoke. Her voice was calm, almost quiet, but every word carried a precise weight. "Sergeant Mercer," she said slowly, "you should step back into that car, get in, and drive away." Mercer blinked once, surprised by the wording. Then his lips curled with disbelief. "Excuse me." Evelyn did not raise her voice. "This is the last opportunity you are going to have to leave this road with your career intact." Deputy Briggs looked up sharply, sensing the meaning hidden inside those words. Mercer, however, only laughed. It was a short, mocking laugh that echoed across the gravel. "You hear that?" Mercer said, glancing briefly toward Briggs. "Now she's threatening my career." Evelyn stood perfectly still. "I'm giving you a warning," she continued calmly, "because if you take another step forward, you will not like what happens next." Mercer shook his head slowly, amusement written across his face. "Lady, you must have lost your mind." He lifted the handcuffs slightly, letting them jingle in the air. "You think I'm afraid of you?" Evelyn's eyes remained steady, unreadable. "Fear is not the point." Mercer took another deliberate step forward. "Then what is?" Evelyn answered without hesitation. "Experience." Mercer snorted. "Experience?" Evelyn nodded once. "The kind that teaches you exactly how far a situation can go before it breaks." Mercer's smile faded into irritation again. Enough of this. He moved closer, clearly preparing to grab her wrist. You had your chance. Briggs felt the tension spike like a wire pulled too tight. He opened his mouth slightly. Sir, maybe we should... Mercer cut him off with a sharp gesture. Stay out of it. Evelyn watched Mercer approach, her posture still calm, still balanced. Then she gave one final quiet statement, her voice low enough that only the two officers could hear it clearly. Sergeant Mercer, the men who trained me used to say something very simple. Mercer rolled his eyes. Oh, really? Evelyn's gaze hardened just slightly. They said that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation is the second when the other person believes they have already won. Mercer laughed again, louder this time. Well then, he said with mocking confidence as he reached for her arm, I guess I have already won. And with that, he unknowingly eliminated the last chance he would ever have to walk away. Mercer's hand closed around Evelyn's wrist. That was the moment everything changed. What Mercer expected was resistance, maybe panic, perhaps a desperate struggle from a frightened civilian. What he received instead was movement so fast and control that his brain struggled to understand what had happened. Evelyn's body shifted a single inch to the side. Her free hand came up, not in anger, but with surgical precision. In one smooth motion, she rotated her wrist inward, trapping Mercer's thumb against the metal of his own handcuffs. A sharp twist followed. Mercer's confidence vanished instantly. The pressure forced his arm downward, his balance collapsing forward before he could react. Gravel exploded beneath his boots as his body slammed face down onto the road. The handcuffs clattered away across the gravel. Deputy Briggs stared in stunned disbelief. The entire exchange had lasted less than 2 seconds. Mercer groaned as Evelyn's knee settled calmly between his shoulder blades, pinning him firmly against the ground. She had not struck him wildly. She had not panicked. Every movement had been precise, controlled, efficient. The exact kind of motion taught to soldiers who spent years mastering close combat. Mercer tried to push himself up. The attempt failed immediately. Evelyn shifted her weight slightly, applying pressure to a nerve point along his shoulder that forced his arm to lock helplessly beneath him. Do not move, she said quietly. The tone of her voice carried none of the fear Mercer had expected earlier. It carried authority, real authority. Mercer's breathing grew uneven as he struggled to process what had just happened. Get off me, he barked, though the command sounded weaker than before. Deputy Briggs had taken 2 slow steps forward, his eyes wide. Sir, I did not even see her move. Mercer twisted again, attempting to free himself. The pressure increased instantly. His arm froze in place. Evelyn spoke calmly again. Sergeant Mercer, your shoulder joint is currently locked at a 30-degree angle. If you continue resisting, the joint will separate. Mercer stopped struggling immediately. The realization crept across his face as he turned his head slightly, looking back at the woman restraining him with effortless control. What the hell are you? He demanded. Evelyn reached calmly toward the ground and picked up the dropped handcuffs. For a moment she examined them with quiet focus. Then she spoke again, her voice steady. You asked earlier where I came from. Mercer remained pinned beneath her knee, his confidence draining away with every passing second. Deputy Briggs watched silently, the pieces beginning to connect in his mind. Evelyn secured Mercer's own cuffs around his wrists with practiced ease. The metal clicked shut. Only then did she step back, allowing Mercer to roll onto his side. He sat up slowly, breathing harder now, staring at her with stunned disbelief. Evelyn reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and removed a small leather credential case. She opened it calmly and held it where both officers could see. Inside was an identification card marked with the seal of the United States Department of Defense. Beneath, it was another badge bearing the insignia of Joint Special Operations Command. Evelyn Carter looked down at Mercer without raising her voice. Delta Force, she said simply. The words landed like a thunderclap. Mercer's face drained of color. His mind raced backward through every moment of the day. The intimidation, the threats, the gunshot that had taken Rex's life. And now the woman he had mocked stood calmly before him as one of the most highly trained combat operators in the world. Deputy Briggs slowly exhaled under his breath. Mercer could no longer speak. For the first time since arriving on that quiet Montana road, the man who had carried himself like the most powerful person present finally understood something terrifying. He had never been in control of this situation at all. Sergeant Daniel Mercer sat on the gravel road with his own handcuffs locked around his wrists, staring up at Evelyn Carter as if the world had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. The evening air had grown cooler, and the last rays of sunlight stretched across the Montana fields, casting long shadows over the patrol car and the silent road. Deputy Tyler Briggs stood several steps away, still processing what he had just witnessed. The calm precision, the effortless control, the identification now held steadily in Evelyn's hand. Briggs swallowed hard. Delta Force, he repeated quietly, almost himself. Mercer's breathing had grown heavier. The arrogance that had fueled him only minutes earlier had drained away, replaced by something far less familiar. Uncertainty. Fear. He looked down at the cuffs around his wrists, then back up at Evelyn. You cannot do this, he said weakly. Evelyn closed the credential case and slipped it calmly back into her jacket pocket. Her expression remained steady, but her voice carried a quiet authority that filled the empty road. Sergeant Mercer, you discharged your weapon without cause, destroyed private property, abused your authority, and attempted to unlawfully detain a civilian. Mercer shook his head quickly. That dog was aggressive. Evelyn's gaze shifted briefly toward Rex lying quietly on the gravel. When she looked back at Mercer, there was no anger in her eyes, only a cold clarity. Your body camera recorded everything, she said calmly. Mercer froze. Slowly, his eyes lifted toward the small device mounted on his uniform. The realization hit him all at once. Deputy Briggs instinctively glanced at his own camera as well. The silence stretched as the weight of that fact settled in. Mercer's voice lowered. You would not actually send that footage in. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. You already did. Mercer frowned in confusion. Evelyn nodded toward the patrol car. Your radio has been transmitting since the moment you drew your weapon. Dispatch has been listening to everything. Briggs turned toward the cruiser instantly, his eyes widening as he saw the blinking indicator on the dashboard radio. Mercer's face drained of what little color remained. In the distance, faint sirens began to echo across the valley. At first they were barely noticeable. Then they grew louder. Multiple vehicles. Mercer's shoulders slumped as the reality closed in around him. Evelyn stepped calmly toward the side of the road where Rex lay. She knelt briefly beside the loyal dog, resting her hand gently against his fur. The gesture was quiet, respectful. Behind her, Mercer sat helplessly in the gravel, the weight of his actions finally pressing down on him. Within minutes, flashing lights appeared around the bend in the road. 2 sheriff vehicles arrived first, tires crunching as they pulled to a stop beside the scene. Sheriff Harold Whitman stepped out, his experienced eyes immediately scanning the situation. He looked from Mercer sitting cuffed on the ground, to Deputy Briggs standing stiffly beside the cruiser, and finally to Evelyn Carter standing calmly near the roadside. Whitman approached slowly. Evening, he said carefully. His gaze paused on the insignia barely visible inside Evelyn's credential case as she opened it again briefly. The sheriff's expression shifted instantly as recognition dawned. He gave a slow nod of understanding. Ma'am, he said respectfully. Mercer stared at the sheriff in disbelief. Sheriff, you need to get these cuffs off me right now, he demanded, though his voice lacked its earlier force. Whitman looked down at him. Quietly. Sergeant Mercer, the sheriff said, his tone firm, you are going to remain exactly where you are. Mercer's mouth opened, but no words came out. 2 deputies stepped forward. One of them began reading Mercer his rights, while the other gently, but firmly guided him to his feet. The humiliation was complete. The man who had arrived hours earlier, believing himself untouchable, now stood surrounded by flashing lights, handcuffed with his own restraints, as the consequences of his arrogance closed in from every direction. Sergeant Daniel Mercer was guided toward the back of the sheriff's vehicle as the flashing red and blue lights painted the quiet Montana road in slow, rhythmic pulses. The metal door opened, and for the first time that evening Mercer hesitated before stepping inside. The weight of what had happened pressed heavily on his shoulders now. The arrogance that had carried him earlier was completely gone. Without another word, the deputies helped him into the back seat and closed the door with a firm, final thud. The sound echoed softly across the empty fields. Deputy Tyler Briggs stood beside the patrol car, his posture stiff as he watched the scene unfold. His eyes briefly moved toward Evelyn Carter, who remained standing near the roadside where the evening wind gently stirred the tall grass. There was a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself, even now, after everything that had happened. Sheriff Harold Whitman approached her slowly, removing his hat as he did. The gesture was small, but it carried deep respect. "Ms. Carter," Whitman said calmly, "on behalf of this department, I am very sorry for what happened here today." Evelyn looked down briefly toward Rex resting peacefully beside the gravel road. Her hand moved gently across the dog's fur once more. The loss was real, but her expression remained composed. "Thank you, Sheriff," she replied quietly. Whitman nodded. "Internal Affairs has already been notified. The footage from Mercer's camera and radio transmission will be sent to the state investigators tonight." Evelyn gave a small nod of acknowledgement. The sheriff glanced briefly toward the patrol vehicles and then back at her. "You handled this with more restraint than most people could have," he said. "Many in your position would not have remained this calm." Evelyn's eyes moved across the open countryside for a moment before she answered. "Discipline is something you learn early in my line of work." Whitman allowed himself a faint smile of understanding. In the distance, the deputies finished documenting the scene, their movements quieter now, the tension slowly fading away. The sirens were turned off, leaving only the soft sounds of the wind and distant night insects beginning their evening chorus. Eventually, the sheriff gave a respectful nod and stepped away to oversee the final details. One by one, the vehicles began pulling away from the road, their headlights disappearing around the bend that led back toward Silver Ridge. The flashing lights faded until the gravel road returned to darkness and calm. Evelyn remained beside Rex for a few quiet minutes longer. The sky above had deepened into a rich shade of twilight, and the first stars were beginning to appear over the mountain ridge. Carefully, she lifted Rex and carried him toward the edge of her property beneath the large oak tree that stood near the garden fence. The tree had always provided shade during the warm afternoons. Tonight, it would become a place of quiet remembrance. When she finished, Evelyn stood for a moment with her hands resting gently at her sides. The wind moved softly through the branches overhead, rustling the leaves in a peaceful whisper. The road beyond her property was empty again. The danger had passed. The arrogance that once filled it had been replaced by silence and justice. After a moment, Evelyn turned and walked slowly back toward the farmhouse porch. The wooden steps creaked softly beneath her boots as she sat down in the familiar chair where her mornings always began. The countryside stretched peacefully before her once again, calm and still beneath the Montana sky. For the first time since the gunshot echoed across the valley, the land had returned to its natural quiet, and justice at last had restored the balance. Stories like the one you just witnessed often reveal something uncomfortable about power in the human mind. Sergeant Mercer did not wake up that morning planning to destroy his career on a quiet Montana road. What guided his choices was something more subtle and far more dangerous than anger. It was certainty, the certainty that his badge placed him above the woman standing in front of him. The certainty that he already understood who she was, what she was worth, and how the encounter would end. That kind of certainty is where judgment begins to rot. Evelyn Carter, on the other hand, carried the opposite kind of strength. She never raised her voice. She never chased revenge. Even when grief sat at her feet beside Rex, she remained disciplined, patient, and precise. The contrast between those two temperaments tells us something important about character. True authority does not announce itself loudly. It reveals itself through restraint, control, and the quiet confidence that justice will eventually stand on its own feet. In the end, Mercer was not defeated by force. He was defeated by the consequences of his own assumptions. And sometimes, that is the most powerful form of justice there is. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.